This talk will look at the history of this bridge. This is the old stone bridge of Bridgwater, which stood where the present town bridge does today. It was removed in 1794, being too narrow and steep for the traffic of the day, while also being expensive to maintain. This bridge, recorded by John Chubb shortly before it was demolished, was a very old structure and had changed quite a bit over the centuries, this being its final form. So our story starts with one word scribbled in 1089. This is Bridgwater recorded in the Domesday Book, and here you can see the word Brughi. Bridgwater is an Old English name and means Walter's Bridge, literally the bridge that belongs to a man called Walter. Walter is the boring part. He, that is Walter of Dewey, was some Norman lord who hovered up a lot of lands from dispossessed Anglo-Saxons after William the Bastard's conquest of 1066. Walter probably never lived here, he just owned it for a while. The first and older part of the name Bridgwater, bridge, or Brughi as it was then, is the interesting part. When the name was just Brughi, before Walter came along, it literally meant just bridge. Note though that some argue that it might have meant quay, but I think this is very unlikely. There are several reasons why, but for my money, bridge just means bridge in this instance. In modern speak, think of it as referring to the place as the bridge, in the same way you might refer to going into town or going to the shops. You don't need to refer which shops or which town, it seems obvious to your listener. This is probably why Walter was later added to identify which bridge it was, as opposed to, say, Borough Bridge or High Bridge. But it's certainly notable that for a time, this was the only bridge in the area worth noting and didn't need to be distinguished. It was so obvious what was being referred to. So is this bridge the bridge mentioned in 1089? No. Well, mostly no. These arches certainly aren't, and these piers, it's hard to say, but it's quite unlikely. Let's imagine there's no bridge here, and think about the sheer problem of building anything over the River Parrett. As we only look down into the river from the bridge, it's worth pondering how actually deep it is. In 1793, a survey of the river showed that the riverbed to the low water mark was about 5 foot 10 inches, which is roughly 1 inch taller than the average UK male today. From the low water mark to high water mark, it was about 22 more feet, which is about the size of a giraffe. For better scale, all in, you can get about 2 stories of a modern building between the riverbed and the bottom of the bridge. So if you're looking to build a bridge here, you're looking at quite a substantially tall job already. Then we need to take into account how moody the River Parrett is. You have to take into account the flow of the river in both directions, depending on the tide. Then you need to account for the force of the tidal wave, in the form of the bore, smashing into it from time to time. And next we have the problem of medieval materials. The Anglo-Saxon Brughi Bridge was presumably, and at a best guess, a timber bridge. The Saxons could build decent bridges, but they tended to be in timber. In later Anglo-Saxon England, there was an impressive infrastructure built around the country to support the king's army, so this bridge may have been part of that essential network. But if there was a timber bridge, it would have needed constant repairing and treating, or even replacement, to withstand the forces of the river. Any elaborate timber structures built into the river are first going to rot eventually, and second, they're going to be bashed apart by the bore. I turn your attention to the old wharf on the riverbank by the telescopic bridge, which was built around 1871 and had the advantage of being made in massive pieces of imported Scandinavian timber and supported with sturdy metal fixings, not available in the previous century. So although this structure has the advantages over medieval construction in being to the side of the river and being made in better materials and with better supports, it didn't survive much more than a century. So the origins of this bridge probably come in the year 1200, when Bridgwater is founded as a town. Best buddy to King John, William Brewer, had acquired a large estate in the area and had set about turning the small settlement here into a proper town, with rights, burgesses and markets. He built himself a massive castle, and while he was at it, he probably made a start on a proper stone bridge to replace whatever the Saxons had previously put up. In this period, if you wanted something to last, you're going to need to build in stone to withstand the tides. The trouble with this is that stone is very expensive and very heavy. Up to about 1200, the architectural norm was for arches to be rounded, as seen here on the Watergate of Bridgwater Castle, which could only support a certain span before collapsing, which would mean the need for several stone piers, known as cutwaters, going across the river to support tiny arches. So the best solution in 1200 would have been to build only a couple of cutwaters and then have a timber roadway built on top. Building stone cutwaters into a riverbed is hard work though, And here are a few stills from a wonderful video of the building of the Charles IV Bridge in Prague, and there'll be a link somewhere so you can watch it yourself afterwards. Essentially, you have to pile in a dam to the riverbed, pump out the water, then build the structure within. But as Brewer was building such a substantial castle nearby, adding a bridge to the to-do list wouldn't have been such a big deal, as he would have had some of the most expert engineers of his day on hand, and he had access to all the talent the royal court could offer. It is likely that Brewer's bridge consisted of 2 large cutwaters set into the bottom of the riverbed, upon which a timber structure then spanned the gaps. This bridge required regular repairs, but the town possessed a common fund to pay for these, and a condition of being a townsman of Bridgwater was to contribute to the upkeep of the Great Bridge. The bridge would have been the last easy crossing point on the River Parrett before the sea, save for a fording point and ferry at Cummich, used at low tide and high tide respectively, and also as far inland as sea traffic could go, meaning all goods would have to be unloaded at Bridgwater and put onto barges to head upstream. In the Foundation Charter of Bridgwater, Brewer was granted the right of pontage, the levying of tolls on crossing a bridge, and in the 15th century, tolls were charged on loaded carts crossing the bridge, suggesting that unladen carts and pedestrians could pass free of charge. The 16th century antiquarian John Leland reported that locally the bridge was remembered as being started by Brewer, but completed by a man called John Trivett. And in the records we can find in 1395 John Trivett, a major West Country landowner, giving money for the improving of the bridge at Bridgwater, and work was completed on this in 1400. This phase probably saw the addition of the 3 pointed stone arches we see in Chubb's illustrations, and these pointed arches were much stronger than the rounded arches seen in the Watergate, and would have replaced the wooden roadway and made it much easier to maintain. Again, this was a substantial undertaking. A huge wooden frame will have needed to have been built, then the stone arches rested upon these, then gradually built up. In medieval documents there are mentions of houses on the bridge. Whether they were literally built onto the bridge or just adjoining the bridge is unclear, although the latter is much more likely. It was certainly not unusual to find houses, shops and even chapels built onto the top of medieval bridges, although Bridgwater's bridge was probably too narrow for that. There is also mention of a chapel on Bridgwater's bridge, which was served by the Franciscan friars, although sadly we do not know more about this feature. Medieval bridge chapels can be seen at St Ives in Cambridgeshire, Bradford upon Avon and Rotherham, and these ones were built atop enlarged cutwaters. Again, the bridge in Bridgwater would probably have been a bit too small for these things, so the chapel may have been just in an adjoining building, and we can see these recorded by Chubb. The bridge that Trivett paid to be completed once bore that man's arms on the side, although these do not appear on Chubb's illustration. It is possible they were removed along with an entire central arch of the bridge during the civil wars of the 1640s. During the storm of Bridgwater in 1645, there is mention of a drawbridge at the bridge, and historians have usually taken this to suggest that one of the arches of the bridge had been removed and replaced by a drawbridge, and this arch was presumably rebuilt after the wars, or it could be that the bridge was left untouched and a pit was dug at one end. We're not sure. Finally, the stone bridge was removed in 1794, as mentioned earlier, and this was when a new iron bridge was constructed, and more on that later. This iron bridge, though, was not the one of today, which was built later in 1883. However, it proved difficult to remove the old stone cutwaters of the medieval bridge, and they remained for a number of years as convenient moorings for ships in the river undergoing repairs, which is a sad end to such a glorious structure.